So I'd like to welcome you, Maywa, to the Coronavirus Multispecies Reading Group. Thank you so much for sharing this paper, What Grows in a Pandemic. You've got a lot of really important conceptual work that you've done here, and also empirical work, integrating a lot of things that we're starting to know about the food system during the pandemic, particularly in the United States. But I think your piece also does a good job of provincializing the conversation in the States and sort of situating it within broader agroecological networks. And as we're starting out, I thought I'd just ask you to maybe start to lay out some of the key concepts that you introduce in the piece. Metabolic rift is one, sort of going back to Marx through a lot of other more recent secondary sources, and also abolition. And part of the innovation of this piece is kind of bringing together those two traditions of thinking and research. So maybe if you could just outline some of those concepts.
For sure, thank you. I began the paper really thinking about an agroecological intervention in food systems, because we were seeing a lot of really news media talking about how catastrophic and absurd it was that farmers were dumping onions and potatoes and broccoli. The New York Times had this amazing feature interviewing farmers that were plowing their harvests under. And so my original intervention was to think about, like, yeah, agroecology is an alternative way of producing things. We can regionalize and localize, because part of the research that my lab at Davis is doing, I did my postdoc at Davis, is we also saw that kind of orthogonally to the choke points in the industrial supply chains that had previously been serving commercial operations like restaurants and businesses and corporate offices, that while those were like drowning in surplus, we also saw that community supported agriculture, farmers markets, direct to farmers supply chains were booming. We had like 300, 500% increase in demands for local and regional production systems. So I was like thinking about this in January, February, March of last year, and I had written a piece that was going to be arguing for an intervention along 3 or 4 axes. I had labeled them R's because I like some, poetry, I guess, about relocalizing, revitalizing biodiversity, and more in an STS framework, kind of reviving indigenous and alternative ways of knowing. Then May happened, George Floyd was murdered, and I was in the midst of responding to my reviewers' feedback, and I was like, this just feels stale. Like, it's not moving me. I feel like I'm kind of repackaging what agroecology movements and food sovereignty movements have been saying for a long time, but with a COVID hook. And so I started to try and dig a little bit deeper into theories of the metabolic rift. In brief, the idea is that it's a social ecological metabolism that has been ruptured. Marx talked about it through spatial separations originally. With the advent of industrial capitalism and industrial agriculture, you had peasant dispossession, people literally through agrarian transitions moving away from farming landscapes into the nascent satanic mills of factories in places like Lancashire and Manchester. The growing population there, the urban workforce required cheap food. So you have an impulse to grow food more cheaply. You have simultaneously what he talked about in, really it's interesting because it seems like he was kind of lightly amused by the ridiculous thing that was happening with soil fertility. So the land is being overworked. So soil fertility is a huge crisis in the 19th century, and we're not returning nutrients anymore. The nutrients are winding up being dumped into the Thames River. It literally stinks. There's not really good sewage yet. And so he's like, look what we've done. We've created a huge waste problem on one hand, and we're having now to deal with a soil fertility crisis on the other. And in our like lovely colonial fashion, we're going to the islands off the coast of Peru to steal guano in a form of ecological imperialism. So that is kind of the origins of the metabolic rift. And later scholars have followed that, argued that there has been a second rift separating livestock from crops. And I think there we really see the origins of the concentrated animal feeding operations, the CAFOs, and arguably one of the most important incubators of epidemics and pandemics today was in these concentrated animal feeding operations. So that's kind of the rift argument, but I wanted to deepen that because agroecology has a ready response to animal and crop separations by beginning to reintegrate animals into agriculture. So I'm not really a specialist in that area, but I've been teaching a little bit more on it this year and have been appreciating what it means to revitalize animals in agroecosystems. So I wanted to lift that up, but in response also to widespread reckonings with anti-Black racism worldwide, I wanted to talk a little bit more about this deep and kind of seething rift that is more epistemic and social, though also ecological. And that's how I combined work that I was doing on the side, sort of in my other life as an organizer for police abolition in California and at the UCs, and to try and make some of those connections. So I did a lit review and I was like, oh, agroecology often is fairly silent on these aspects. Where I would find it is like in the string of items like gender, race, class, but it was never really being pointedly talked about. Now, I want to caveat that by saying too that it's very hard to criticize agroecology for being silent on race when some of the, I think, most prominent agroecologists in the global South are indigenous communities and movements. So it's like, what am I talking about? But within, especially in the US literature, and especially in the way that it's been talked about in the framework of a transformative paradigm for social change, an ecology of food systems, there really hasn't been enough, I would say, of a reckoning with what it means to be anti-racist or to be talking about bringing in knowledge forms from a wider array of communities. So I started kind of, maybe you all are familiar with David Harvey. When he teaches Marx, he talks about rubbing these different bricks together to make revolutionary fire. And I feel like as somebody who is a fairly like interdisciplinary person, I feel like that is what I often find myself trying to do, is find those weird bricks and rub them together and see if a spark flies and if it catches hold. So that's what I was trying to do by bringing abolition into conversation with agroecology. I can talk a little more about how I do that, but I also don't want to just like ramble. So I'd love to hear any questions or comments so it becomes more of a dialogue than a monologue.
Thank you. I've got a lot more questions. Other people should also feel free to jump in. So maybe I'll give other folks a chance. If you don't have a question, I'll jump in.
Just a lexical question. What is an STS framework?
Oh, excuse me. Science, technology and society, or science and technology studies. So looking at science as constructed, as embedded in social, political, and cultural practices and institutions rather than science is truth. That's what I mean by that.
That's really helpful. Thanks.
One of the phrases or sentences that I really liked is on page 23, when agroecologists like abolitionists hear that their plans are not simply realistic, when agroecologists and abolitionists hear that their plans are simply not realistic, the answer can and should be, in spite of everything, it is already real. So kind of, if kind of the scope and scale of change is being criticized by these naysayers, I think it's a really interesting move to just kind of look at present historical reality and as it is, as not as something that could be scaled up and so maybe if you could talk about like the reality that is and the future that might be, and kind of holding those two realities together.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. So one of the, I think, strong parallels that I see in the different conversations around agroecology and abolition is this, often we confront the like, that's nice, or it sounds very romantic, but it's utopian. It's not realistic. We always run into that. And there are a couple of responses to it. So one is, I think in the first lesson, I just labeled them lessons in the paper, I was really inspired by this quote from Angela Davis, where she talks about the slavery, lynching, and segregation are certainly compelling examples of social institutions that, like the prison, were once considered to be as everlasting as the sun. So I was thinking about these everlasting suns. What are the everlasting suns that we live with and we don't question? There's, it brought to mind this literature from science and technology studies, again, on normals and how we actually produce normals in society. It brought to mind Gramscian common sense, like how do we destabilize common sense? How do we elevate and make common sense critical? And, looking around, and I think Davis was absolutely right. She was writing in 2003, but saying like, we would not really take a congressperson seriously if they were like, yeah, we need to have slavery again, like that. We've gone beyond where that kind of common sense is tractable in society. So why would we think that? I don't find it unimaginable at all that we consider a world where it looks pretty crazy to be putting animals at tens of thousands in number into cages and saying like, that's just the way we eat, or that we throw human beings into cages and assume that that's going to be a way of dealing with healing and with violence in society. Like that, it doesn't seem to me at all like beyond the ken that those everlasting suns see a twilight. And so I was inspired by that. And I was also thinking about a webinar, because everything's been a webinar for a year, with the People's Agroecology process. And one of the farmers from Organización Boricua in Puerto Rico, in response to this, like, agroecology is impossible. He's like, do you know that globally, the majority of food, roughly 70% of food, is produced by smallholder peasants? Like this is not an unusual thing. It's happening already. Like we have so many examples of it, and it's a problem that agroecologists are confronting. I'm working with a team now in connection with the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. It's like, what is the evidence base? How are we supposed to prove that agroecology works? And it's really interesting because I think there are different thresholds for criteria that we assume like must be met to prove that it works. And a lot of times that's circumscribed by the way that we define and legitimize certain types of expertise over others. And so it's much easier for us to like take crude measurements of yield, but we know much, much less about whether people are actually getting fed, let alone nourished. And agroecology has a much harder time, I think, meeting the criteria, but it's also because we're very constrained in terms of what we understand to be legitimate and authoritative types of evidence shown. So that's what I was kind of thinking through these, like, it's already happening already. And in the same in abolition, there is quite a bit of literature, in fact, on the way that policing does not help actually when it comes to sexual violence, when it comes to intervention on in terms of like at the UCs, many of the cases that are wind up in the UCPD getting called have to do with psychological trauma, and like there's very little evidence that those interventions help at all and usually make things worse. And so it's just like kind of trying to pivot the evidence base if we're going to be trying to speak on the terms of policymakers and others is like, we want to talk about evidence, let's have that conversation. So that's what I was inspired by, Eben. It's a really great question.
I was interested in the quote that you had, outbreaks incubating the heartlands of agribusiness. And also right before that, you
Zoom is telling me that my internet connection is unstable. So go ahead, Rachel.
Okay. I think just before that, you were also, making some links between wild foods and kind of the where state support or state subsidies were going, and for which producers. And so it seemed to me that there was this continuation of kind of an erasure of small scale producers. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the connections that you were making about outbreak specifically and agribusiness in this particular historical moment, and what the links that you chose to really underscore there.
Yeah, thank you. I want to give a shout out to my colleague Rob Wallace, evolutionary biologist and epidemiologist, who I feel like has done so much very important work on the political ecology of disease and pandemics. It's really me learning from him and kind of folding it into my own background knowledge that I was able to make this argument. So what I'm going to try and like talk about is really refracted through Rob. I wish he was here in the room with us, but his argument in short is that we can think about these hotbeds of pathogenicity coming at different like ends of the supply chain. One of those being the heartlands of agribusiness, as you mentioned, Rachel, these CAFOs where we literally like smash all these animals together by the tens of thousands in confinement operations. Their being so closely confined means that their immune systems are not healthy, often immune suppressed. They're genetically homogeneous. That makes it very easy from the vantage point of a virus to spread because all the animals are the same. Also, when you take the perspective of a virus, and this comes from virology theory, is like the more difficult it is to find another host, the less virulent you often are. Whereas if it's very easy to jump into another host, you're able to become more virulent. So you've actually like lifted the downward pressure on virality, which becomes very, very dangerous. So he talks at length about the way that concentrated animal feeding operations is creating really the perfect conditions for the next epidemics and pandemics to emerge. So that's one kind of area of focus and concentration, and he has some really great work. His book is called Big Farms Make Big Flu, by the way, and he has essays that link this, because COVID is not unique in this. Like there's some amazing work that he does on H1N1, linking it to NAFTA, And he argues that we should have been calling that the NAFTA flu all along. So the other end of this supply chain is really, I think, where I found quite a bit of traction with agroecology, because this is at the places where industrial mining and logging and agribusiness are cutting into forests and generally less, I put wild in air quotes because indigenous peoples live and work there, but less managed habitats. And in the history, especially of in Chinese agriculture, as I understand it, I'm again not an expert here, but there have been a couple of great leaps, and the agrarian transitions here are really important. So 1978, we saw what's called like the first great leap, and collectivized farms were broken up. More smallholders began cultivating chickens and ducks and pigs in smaller holdings. The second great leap in the 1990s saw what Mindy Schneider calls like the industrial meat regime start to take hold, and the strengthening of meat agribusiness in China means that those smaller farmers who were growing poultry and pig on a small scale are then outcompeted, dispossessed. And a lot of what they've turned to, and this gets to the point of the wild food sector, is starting to cultivate these wild foods. Now, wild foods has a very, very long tradition in Chinese culture, but it is increasingly less of an informal economy than it is now, like bound up in capitalist circuits of commodity flows. So the way that Schneider and Wallace have talked about it is that these smallholders are now kind of being thrust further and further into the forest and are cutting into previously less disturbed areas, and that creates more human wild interface. So I should bracket this by explaining that a complex forest has multiple, what Wallace calls fire breaks on pandemic transmission. So the diversity in a forest has lower population density of viable hosts. So the virus can't easily find a competent host because those individuals are more spread out in a biodiverse habitat. There are biophysical impediments like waterways and trees or other things that would stop organisms from easily moving. And then there's also the genetic diversity. So you're always going to have in a mixed community some genetic backgrounds that are going to be resistant to a virus and therefore slow transmission. So you start to get the simplification of all of that via agribusiness, mining, and logging. You get this kind of new, these populations of smallholders that have been dispossessed by the increasing growth of industrial agriculture, cutting into the forest and being forced further into the frontier. And that is what Wallace claims is creating a kind of this very dangerous condition where the likelihood of viral spillover from places that used to kind of contain viruses into human populations is occurring more rapidly. And then it's not that difficult for these wild food harvesters to bring that to a larger city like Wuhan. The epidemiological evidence seems to be pointing now to Wuhan less as the kind of 0.0 for spillover per se than it was for a human to human super spreader site. So it's probably like the way that Wallace and others have knit it together is very likely that the spillover was somewhere in the hinterland, somewhere at this frontier where ecology is being simplified and the interface between human and wild is becoming more fractured and complex. That is then brought into the marketplace and human to human transmission occurs there. And then, on global capitalist commodity circuits, it's like weeks time before it's in London and Singapore and Moscow and New York City. So that's the way I understand it. It's kind of a story of agrarian transitions, of changing political ecologies of the forest. And also on the other side of the supply chain, the heartlands of agribusiness are the more confinement operations. That's a long-winded answer, but I retraced those steps literally today, just because I wanted to make sure that I could explain it in a way that I understand how those pieces work together.
So I might jump back in if my internet connection remains stable enough for you all to hear me, to sort of add some layers of viral and ecological complexity, and also emerging findings. So for starters, the WHO team found 13 variants in Wuhan, which of basically it's a story of history of science and accumulative, but detection, much like HIV was detected in California, the virus was later identified in France, but emergent stories are spatially geographically located elsewhere. But also wanted to sort of spar a little bit with, Gilmore in the back of my head, but also kind of lively, convivial, multi-species futures in mind, to push and poke at the chains of evidence linking bats to this story. And we've had some virologists on this reading group, including Wim van der Poel, who are experts on veterinary science and coronavirus transmission. And basically, if you look at the genomic evidence, the links to rat tag, which is the bat coronavirus that's been, in the popular press linked to SARS-CoV-2, the most recent common ancestor it shares is probably 1981, somewhere between, I think, like 1948 and 1981 is the point of divergence of those two. And I think, when we look back at this in a few years, the bat story could also be a product of history of science. So one of the people you cite in the paper, Peter Daszak, has heavily funded bat coronavirus research for 10, 20 years now. And that's simply where we have the most animal coronavirus genomes. And I think in the same way that you're really careful in these outbreak narratives centered on exotic peoples, I think we also need to be careful about outbreak narratives centered on exotic animals, whether it's bats or pangolins. So yeah, for me, the interesting things about your paper are the attention you're bringing us to configurations rather than contagion, to use the words of Steve Hinchcliffe. And I think you're making some really interesting parallel points to, the multi-species ethnography project has been all about, as you say on page 104, about the way that nature transforms society, and in turn how nature is socially produced. And I think the configurations that you're showing us and the agro-industrial assemblages, the ways that speed, velocity, capital accumulation are producing conditions of possibility for emergence are super important. And I think, the cautionary tale is, don't demonize the bats, and also don't necessarily demonize the viruses either. I think, the ways that virology has been this field driven by fear, and the ways that we only know a tiny little fraction of the virus sphere. So, we basically know the pathogens. We know the human pathogens, we know some of the animal pathogens, but 99.9% of the virus sphere is totally unknown. It contains the abundance of genetic diversity on the planet. And I think as we come to know more symbiotic stories of viral coexistence, maybe that's part of these agrarian agroecology futures that have room for bats and that have room for viral biodiversity, where some of the insights from Rob Dunn's lab about the gut microbiome, where having certain bacteria protects you against the baddies that are kind of new on the scene. Having a robust microvirome, a virome is particular, the viral assemblage in a particular being. Having a robust virome might be kind of the conditions of possibility for pandemic survival. And so just a plug for the bats and the viruses as you think about agroecological futures.
I really appreciate that. As an undergrad, I was actually in a microbiology lab. I worked on agrobacterium for my bachelor's honors thesis, and was really compelled by trying to understand the world from the perspective of a bacterium rather than from an anthropocentric perspective. Now I'm like a social scientist, and sometimes I feel like we've in the attempt to call attention to human rights discourse, for example, at the level of the FAO, when it comes to food systems, we've kind of completely forgotten what for indigenous peoples is very obvious, that we are part of an ecosystem and humans are only one element in that larger ontological universe. So I really appreciate lifting up the viruses and the bats. One thing that I love about agroecology, and I feel like language sometimes doesn't do it justice, but for example, when we talk about pest management, so in a lot of the literature, you'll see people talking about using biological control and beneficial organisms as pest control. But when you really talk to agroecologists who are in it and who understand the risks of language too, they're like, we don't really like to use the word pest. This is not an issue of controlling pests. It's about finding balances amongst different organisms, because that is what you're talking to, I think, Eben, is that it's a convivial universe. We're not in the business here of eradicating and controlling and demonizing certain organisms at the expense of others. We're trying to get some sustenance out of this ecosystem. Other organisms are doing the same. And we've got different kinds of thresholds and balances to contend with. Obviously, there are certain ways that we are managing this system, but it's not about a pest. Thank you for that. I love where that's going, and I'd like to star that in my thinking too, because I think it's very easy, especially when it's a pandemic that has caused so many tragedies, that the instant response is destroy, but that's kind of anti-abolitionist too. Eradication.
Yeah, thanks for the generous response. Elizabeth and I right now are working on a new book collection called The Promise of Multispecies Justice. And one of the key things that we're identifying in thinking about justice is that it's about both identifying and holding on to the beautiful, as well as identifying what one must fight. And I think this piece that you've offered us does a great job of both those things. And I just wanted to maybe bring our attention for a moment to the ugly, which you've also clearly identified. You've talked about how OSHA basically indemnified meatpacking companies from spreading the coronavirus. You've talked about the antitrust laws that were passed to take care of the big five, but now we have the big four in the meatpacking industry. So I think this article does important work in terms of naming the powerful and sort of identifying, Tyson, Cargill, Smithfield, JBS, these big conglomerates that are kind of dominating the food industry. And I guess maybe as you're imagining the beautiful, as you're imagining the conditions of possibility for abolition, you're thinking with Black agrarianism and the reparations movement. How do you see, given the current configurations of power, how do you see kind of dismantling that system and going from that the reality of the now for agroecology that you describe in some parts of the world to a future where, you know, Tyson, Cargill, and the others aren't sort of in control of the food system?
Such a good question. First, I'll start by responding that what abolition practice and theory inspired me to think about when it came to agroecology is sort of, it was very obvious to me that agroecology is this kind of Gilmorian presence, right? It's if abolition is about simultaneous dismantling of systems of oppression and also imagining and creating life-affirming institutions, I feel like agroecology is like sitting there saying, I'm that life-affirming institution and practice and epistemological framework for land-based life. And so I wanted to like just not fill the gap. I really dislike that language, by the way, in scholarly literature, so many gaps to fill. But just to signify that agroecology has that at its center, but also the converse is that I think sometimes the alternative food movements don't spend enough time reckoning like with the dismantling of systems of violence and oppression. It's and it becomes very hard at a certain juncture to go beyond a niche alternative. And this is very clearly etched in the history of the organic movement, where, you know, California agriculture, and Julie Guthman at Santa Cruz has done an extraordinary piece of scholarship documenting the conventionalization of organic, because it starts to be disciplined by industrial agriculture, by capitalist political economy, and very soon you have kind of bio-based inputs and industrial organic found at everywhere from like Walmart to Whole Foods. It may be marginally better in terms of being less pesticide based, but it has not substantially like transformed the system towards sustainability or equity. So the capacity of kind of hegemonic food systems to constrain and reshape the emergent alternatives, I think really meets us with a real, it's humbling, but a real requirement to enact that eradication of systems of violence. So I think that was the lesson from abolition, is like part of the alternative of agroecology is thinking about that those lock-ins of power. And so obviously consolidation of capital, you see the structures of control from the input producers like Bayer, which, you know, recently acquired Monsanto. People still like recognize Monsanto, so I often use both, but they are one now. To the ADMs and Cargills at the center, to the Walmarts at the retail end, like that monumental amount of capital and power, like that must be dismantled. So that's one piece that I feel like the agroecology movement or the alternative food system movement must always kind of contend with that piece of it. But it's as well, I think, I don't have all the answers, but what I like to think through, and what I'm hoping to kind of find more communities to think through these processes with, is that it's not really just about finding metaphorical parallels between the abolition movement and the agroecology movement. It's actually about creating material coalitions, you know, coalition building, and seeing that we are actually talking about the same revolution. We're talking about building movements together to dismantle these systems of imperialism, colonialism, and racial capitalism that we create tomorrow by linking our efforts, because they actually are one. So I've been in so many webinars where people are like, how do we do this? And some of the best responses that I hear people say is like, don't ask me, go out into your communities and find people who are already doing this, who are already making tomorrow's possible, and ask them, how can I help? So that's kind of what I what I tried to live into rather than prescribe. But those were some of the ways that I've been thinking through it.
I have a bit of a comment, and I think I did my bachelor's and master's at Purdue University, which is a land grant cooperative extension, and I worked in ag extension. And it's, people tend to forget that the whole reason factory farming got off the ground so quickly was information disseminated through cooperative extension and through land grant universities. There's also the potential for change there, and to engage with those people. They are at the forefront of changing agricultures too. I mean, agriculture gets this bad idea that they're, kind of backward thinking in terms of research and production agriculture, but there's a lot more to it. And they are at once, part of the system, but are also the ones that instantiated major changes in agricultural production in the last 50 years. So I think that we need to engage those folks in real serious dialogue rather than demonize them as kind of being owned by, Bayer or being owned by whoever, because there's a lot of good folks that are working on the inside to try and get these sorts of, smallholder production, major departments at universities off the ground. So that's just kind of one thing that I've been thinking through, that, coming from having worked in that side of it. And then the other thing is that, I think you hit the nail on the head with smallholders being, the major food producers. And people forget, on the one hand, I live in a county that has Fair Oaks Farms, which has like an amusement park with their dairy production. And they, there's a million crazy things. It's a mind meld to go there, going on there. But the other thing is that, local folks don't like factory farms. If farmers don't like factory farms, local folks that are rural pretty much don't like them for a lot of reasons. And I think that there's so much to go through here, but you gotta tangle with the people you don't want to tangle with in some respects. Maybe the easier people to deal with in these kind of difficult questions, because if they're left to the side, then they're not going to get this kind of input. They're not going to understand. And this is also a place where there's still rampant inequalities and segregation in both crop and animal agriculture production. The immigrant farmers still come here, and migrant farmers still come here to work to this county, and you never see them. And so you have to kind of peel back the layers, and it's a weird, wild thing to be in rural America. And there is a place for growth and change here, I think, and it starts with engaging with the ag folks at your land grant college, which I think UC Santa Cruz is part of that, right? Yeah. And in California is so different than here, but
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's just my 2 cents. There's a lot of people wanting to change things from that angle, so I think that we need to start working on that as well. But this is beautiful. I love the integration of abolitionists and changing ideas about food production and agroecology. That's as an archaeologist, we love agroecology just for a lot of reasons. So it's kind of an interesting way to think about it. So thank you.
Thank you, Kate. This is amazing. I actually did not know that agroecology and archaeology have some love going on. That's wonderful to hear. I grew up in rural East Tennessee, and so I definitely hear you on the way that we can make a lot of assumptions about what folks want or prioritize in the rural United States. In California, it's very horticulture based, but we do have a very strong cooperative extension unit in the UC. Some of my close colleagues are kind of transforming what it means to do cooperative extension by working very closely. Christy Getz works with Latinx farm workers. Jenny Sauerwein with the Karuk UC Collaborative is working with Indigenous communities on cooperative extension projects, thinking about land reparations and Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge and how that informs and inspires a new ethic and relations with one another and the land. One of my good agroecology colleagues and comrades is at Indiana University now. She's a new assistant professor at IU Bloomington. And so, but she did tell me, she's like, this is another universe, Maywa, the undergrads and grad students, they come up with a certain kind of critical analysis of all that's wrong with the global capitalist food system, and you come to Indiana and like you have to kind of start where people are too. So I hear that and honor that. One of my inspirations is farmer Jim Goodman. He's a dairy farmer at the university. Sorry, he's not at the university. He's president of the National Family Farm Coalition and a founder of Family Farm Defenders. And Jim is now working on projects to do with parity and with supply management. The National Family Farm Coalition worked closely with the Sanders campaign and with Elizabeth Warren to try and really center transformative economic policy into their platforms, because we live with a food regime of structural overproduction, which has many like global ramifications, but also farmers, they don't necessarily want to be growing 10,000 hectares or acres of soybeans. Like this is the treadmill that they're on and they run it, but that's not really what they want. Like farm prices are too low and they make negative 1,000 some revenue per year. Like this is not sustainable, and that those commodities go primarily to feed animals and cars. Like, so it gets right back to the kind of causal chains of the pandemic, is like we're living in a structural overproduction of cheap commodities and winding up with a lot of problems that, you know, those aren't necessary or normal. So thank you, Kate. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I like your response too, because it's just, you know, it's simultaneously part of the structure building and also, you know, part of being stuck on the structure. So I really think that there's a lot of good things that can come out of those comments, as you well put. So thank you very much.
I just have one more question. Oh, go ahead, Amina, if you've got a question.
Well, I was just going to take us in a really different direction. Maybe it's a dead end. But I was really taken with this idea of, instead of swine flu, a NAFTA flu, because instead of demonizing an animal or a critter, or even, the microbe itself, you're demonizing not a people, but a process, right? And if you're going to demonize anything, let's demonize processes, ways that we are and move in the world. And it struck me because I think you, Eben, just really quickly ran by something that must have been in a session before I joined up, talking about that shift from pre-modern diseases as events, as processes, as ecologies, to this modern shift to disease becoming a noun. It's moving from an event or a verb to a noun again. So it's demonizing the critter. But then also today I was writing for a non-academic journal for an Episcopal, the denomination of the Episcopal Church was wanting me to just think with them about what is evil. And it's really interesting because evil from the time of the beginning of Christianity up until the present moment has been most defined through the metaphor of disease. Disease, death, decay, and rot, specifically, all of which are microbial processes, but which, again, were much more like an event or an occurrence. They weren't actual things. Theologians used words like disease because they didn't think disease existed yet as a noun. And so it's just, maybe this goes nowhere, but it's just curious to me that here we are again, naming the enemy as a creature, as a critter, instead of as the way some of the biggest or most powerful critters right now are moving in the world and consolidating resources, et cetera. So it was a small insight, but you pointing that out was really opening things up for me.
Would you like to respond, Ibn?
Sure. Yeah. So I think referencing two sets of readings that we did early on. We had John Dupre and Stefan Goodinger on, and they talked about the virus as a living process to sort of sidestep this debate in the philosophy of biology about whether they're alive or not alive. It's thinking about the virus as a living process that interfaces with processes on cellular levels. And I think, in my own work, I'm starting to expand out to think about intergenerational processes like racism and how, commodity chains and agrarian assemblages constitute processes, capital flows, that kind of thing. And then the reading that we did with Steve Hinchcliffe on configuration rather than contagion, I think is another intervention in that same sort of thing. So to think about NAFTA as a configuration, a set of relationships, I think could go along with Hinchcliffe's analysis of global health and sort of legacies of colonialism.
I'll have to go back and watch. I think they're all recorded, right?
Yep.
My camera is broken, so I'm like, yeah, you can't see my reactions, but yeah, I was really appreciating your comments there. I mean, I don't think it's a dead end at all, and I think it also, it also connects in kind of to the other part of Maywa's paper of like abolition and the legal system seeing harm as a noun, seeing harm as a solitary event that occurs in isolation and then therefore requires kind of prefigured response in the way that like sentences are determined, through kind of fixed algorithms. Whereas, alternative justice systems more and more have always and more are seeing, understanding harm as a process and therefore, response to harm as a long-term process. And that just kind of really speaks to, one of the bases of a lot of abolitionist practice. And I think about this a lot myself because, I have in the past like interacted with people, incarcerated for life. And I do work facilitating like domestic violence intervention sessions. And so I sit and I think a lot. I'm like, what is evil? Like, is it a real thing? And has it existed in these people that I'm forming relationships with? And but yeah, like seeing it as a constituted by processes is, I think, really just enlightening. And yeah, I feel like I maybe wanted to ask another tangential question myself, but in the interest of time, I might hold on to it.
Yeah, thanks for that response.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. And we are at the witching hour, so maybe Elizabeth, if you want, we could make sure that you get Maywa's email address and channel the question that way. I also wanted to plug, so you cite Lyle Fearnley's work in this piece, and next week we're discussing Lyle's new book, Virulent Zones. He'll be joining us from Singapore, so it would be lovely to have you back. And yeah, just thank you for sharing this very wide-ranging essay that integrates so many important things. So thank you, Maywa. Welcome to the group.
Thank you so much. I appreciated the excellent questions, and I'd love to follow up with any of you. Really inspired by the context and the thought that you gave, and the close read as well. It's really lovely to be in conversation with you, and I'd definitely be interested to join next week if y'all have me.
Yeah, anytime. We'll put you on the email list, and come back whenever you have time.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
Cheers.
Good to see you.
Nice to meet you.